On the 4th of August 2022, 6 months and a few days after Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border, a small company quietly registered with the Ukrainian state. Its founding capital was 100,000 hryvnia, roughly $2,500 at the exchange rate of the time. Its primary listed business activity was vehicle maintenance and repair. There was nothing about its registration paperwork that would have caught anyone's attention. The country had bigger problems than a small Kyiv area company filing the paperwork to fix cars. 3.5 years later, in April 2026, that same company unveiled the first domestically designed and built tracked armored personnel carrier in the history of independent Ukraine. The vehicle weighs 15 tons. It carries 8 infantrymen behind a NATO Stanag Level 4 frontal armor plate that can stop a 14.5mm armor-piercing round. It is powered by a 360 horsepower diesel engine. It has a remotely operated weapon station, electronic warfare equipment, situational awareness systems, an air conditioner, and a filtration unit for chemical and biological threats. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense had a specific brief for it. The vehicle had to outperform the American M113. By April 2026, that was not a high bar. Of the 1,497 M113 family armored personnel carriers that had been donated to Ukraine by 10 different countries since the start of the war, at least 675 had been visually confirmed as destroyed. That is a 45% loss rate. The Ukrainian fleet of American APCs was being burned alive on the battlefield, mostly by Russian first-person view drones that cost a fraction of what each carrier did. The Americans had built the M113 in 1960. 66 years later, in a war that none of its original designers could have imagined, it was being killed in numbers that had no precedent in Western military history. Somebody had to design a replacement. Nobody in any major Western defense company was going to design one for the specific conditions of the Ukrainian front in time to matter. So, a Ukrainian repair shop that had filed its paperwork 6 months into the war did it themselves. The vehicle is called the Skif. The company is called UkrArmoTech. The man who runs it is named Hennadii Khirhii. And the story of how an unknown auto repair business founded with $2,500 built the country's first tracked combat platform in 3.5 years is, depending on how you look at it, either a remarkable triumph of wartime industrial improvisation or a damning indictment of the entire Western defense industry that should have done it years earlier. To understand UkrArmoTech, you have to understand what was happening in Ukraine in the spring and summer of 2022 that made a company like it possible in the first place. By that point, 6 months into the full-scale war, several things had become brutally clear about the kind of conflict Ukraine was in. The first was that the Soviet-era armored vehicles Ukraine had inherited from independence in 1991 were being chewed up at rates that nobody's pre-war planning had anticipated. The second was that Western donations of armored vehicles were generous but slow, conditional, and entirely dependent on the political weather in capitals thousands of miles away. The third was that whatever Ukraine could not build for itself, it would eventually run out of. The fourth was that nobody in the Ukrainian defense establishment had any meaningful experience building tracked armored vehicles from scratch, because the Soviet armor plants that had once done that work were either in the parts of Ukraine now occupied by Russia or had been quietly atrophying for decades. Into that gap, in the second half of 2022, came a wave of new Ukrainian defense startups. Some of them were drone companies. Firepoint, the cruise missile makers, was one of them. Others were ammunition specialists, electronic warfare developers, parts suppliers, or, in the case of UkrArmoTech, vehicle people. The country needed armored vehicles, lots of them, fast, and Western donations alone were not going to cover the demand. Khirhii's company started where the gap was simplest to fill. They built wheeled armored vehicles on commercially available chassis. The first product, the Hryvnia 01, was constructed on the basis of an American Dodge civilian truck chassis. They added armor plating, weapons mounts, and military communications equipment. It was not glamorous engineering. It was the kind of work that would make a Western defense industry magazine sneer. but it produced an armored vehicle that could roll out the factory door, get to the front lines, and carry Ukrainian soldiers from one place to another without getting them killed by small arms fire. By 2023, the company had brought in roughly 400 million hryvnia in revenue, about $10 million. By 2024, that figure had grown to 3.9 billion hryvnia, almost $100 million. It was a 9-fold revenue increase in 12 months. Their staff went from 45 people in 2023 to 632 people in 2024. They built more sophisticated vehicles, the Hryvnia-02 and the Tisa and the Desna. They started to develop what would become a recognizable Ukrainian military-industrial profile. They were profitable. They were growing. They were paying taxes. They were, as much as any company in a country at war could be, normal. Last year alone, they delivered approximately 400 armored vehicles to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. By the end of 2025, Hennadii Khirhii sat down with reporters from Defense Express, the most important Ukrainian military trade publication, and announced that his company was going to do something it had never done before. They were going to build a tracked vehicle. The decision was, on its face, slightly insane. Tracked armored vehicles are an order of magnitude harder to build than wheeled armored vehicles. The drivetrain is more complicated. The suspension system is more complicated. The transmission has to handle continuous side-to-side power transfer for steering. The track itself, the road wheels, the drive sprockets, the return rollers, the tensioning systems, the torsion bars, all of these are precision components that have to be either manufactured or imported. And the supply chain for tracked vehicle parts in Europe is dominated by a small number of major Western defense contractors who do not generally take orders from Ukrainian startups. UkrArmoTech had never built a tracked vehicle. Nobody on its payroll had ever designed one from a blank sheet of paper. The company estimated that, even with all the help they could get, around 60% of the components in their first prototype would have to be imported. The engine, the transmission, the suspension elements, the transfer case, the tracks themselves, all sourced from somewhere outside Ukraine, with all the supply chain risks that implied for a company in a country at war. Khirhii's reasoning, which he explained to Defense Express in an interview that has since been quoted in roughly every English-language piece written about the Skif, was operational rather than commercial. The Ukrainian military, he said, had asked them to do it. Specifically, the Ukrainian military had told them what wheeled armored vehicles could and could not do on the kind of terrain Ukrainian troops were now fighting on. Wheels, Khirhii pointed out in his interviews, are faster on paved roads, cheaper to maintain, and easier to build, but Ukraine in spring and autumn turns into mud. Ukraine in winter, during the thaws, becomes a country where wheeled vehicles get bogged down within meters of leaving the road. Ukraine, in 2026, is also a country where every road and crossroads is potentially mined, and where every armored vehicle that approaches the front lines is hunted by drones. Tracks, Khirhii argued, are better than wheels in mud. Tracks are also more resilient than rubber tires against mine fragments, against artillery fragments, against small arms fire. The rubber tire of a wheeled APC, he pointed out in the same interview, can be flattened by a fragment that a tracked vehicle would simply roll over. Ukraine had, in the M113, an existing tracked APC that solved most of these problems. But Ukraine was running out of M113s. This is the part of the story that the public-facing materials about the Skif do not emphasize, but that any honest accounting of why this vehicle exists has to put at the center. The M113 is being killed in Ukraine. According to the open-source intelligence group Oryx, which tracks visually confirmed losses across the war from photographic and video evidence, at least 675 of the 1,497 M113 family vehicles donated to Ukraine have been destroyed. The actual number is almost certainly higher, because Oryx, by methodological design, only counts losses with clear visual confirmation. The killers are not, mostly, conventional anti-tank weapons. They are first-person view drones, The small kamikaze quadcopters that a Ukrainian or Russian operator with a virtual reality headset can fly directly into the side or top of an armored vehicle for a unit cost of roughly $500 to $1,000. The M113 was designed in the late 1950s. It was built to stop small arms fire, shrapnel, and direct hits from light cannon. Its aluminum hull is thin enough that it gave the vehicle the mobility advantages that made it the most successful APC in Western military history. That same aluminum hull is now being penetrated by shaped-charge munitions strapped to consumer drones that an enterprising teenager could assemble in a garage. The fundamental design assumption underneath the M113, which is that the principal threats to an armored personnel carrier are kinetic energy projectiles fired from the ground, has been broken by the development of cheap, abundant precision munitions delivered from above. The vehicle was not built for a battlefield where it could be killed by a flying object that costs less than the radio inside it. The Ukrainians have done what they can. There are now M113s deployed in Ukraine that have been welded over with steel cope cages, the open-frame anti-drone enclosures that have become ubiquitous on every armored vehicle on both sides of the front. There are M113s covered in welded steel hedgehog spikes that protrude in every direction so that a drone trying to make contact with the hull will detonate against the spikes instead. There are M113s with chain-link curtains hanging from their sides. There are M113s with concrete blocks bolted to their roofs. The improvisations have, in many cases, kept individual vehicles alive. They have not solved the underlying problem. They have, in a number of cases, made it worse, because all the improvised armor adds weight, slows the vehicle, makes it harder to enter and exit through the rear ramp, and makes it a slightly larger and slower target. The M113 was a good vehicle for the war it was designed to fight, which was, broadly, the kind of war that the West expected to fight in Central Europe in the 1960s. It is a vehicle that has been pushed 5 decades past its design parameters into an environment that systematically attacks every weakness in its original specification. This is the hole that the Skif is supposed to fill. It is, by deliberate design, the M113's replacement. Built specifically for a battlefield, the M113 was never built for. It weighs 15 tons, almost identical to a fully loaded M113. It carries the same complement, 3 crew at the front and 8 infantrymen in the back, accessed through a rear ramp identical in concept to the M113's. It uses the same kind of tracked propulsion. The cross-country mobility, the reliability, the maintainability, all the design virtues that made the M113 useful in Ukraine for the first 3 years of the war are deliberately preserved. What changes, almost everywhere, is the protection. The frontal armor is rated to NATO Stanag 4000, 569 level 4, which means it can stop 14 5mm armor-piercing rounds, the standard Russian heavy machine gun cartridge, fired at point-blank range. It can also withstand a 155mm artillery shell exploding 25 meters away, the kind of indirect fire that, in the case of a regular M113, would shred the vehicle with shrapnel. The side and rear armor is level 3, capable of stopping 7, 6, 2mm armor-piercing rounds, and surviving 5mm shells exploding at 60 meters. The hull is rated for mine protection at levels 3A and 3B, meaning it is designed to survive the detonation of approximately 6 kilograms of TNT, either directly under the hull or beneath the tracks. The Ukrainian press has reported these specifications as roughly double the protection of an M113. The figure is correct in broad terms, though armor specifications never translate cleanly into combat outcomes. What it means in practical terms is that a Ukrainian crew driving a Skif into the kind of artillery zone that has been killing M113s by the hundreds will, in theory, have a meaningfully better chance of driving back out. The Skif also carries a remotely operated weapon station on the roof, fitted with either a 12, 7mm or 14, 5mm heavy machine gun, and a 7.62 mm coaxial machine gun, the remote operation matters because it means the gunner does not have to expose his head and shoulders out of the vehicle to fire. On a Ukrainian battlefield where any visible human silhouette is a candidate for a sniper round or a drone strike, that change alone may save a substantial number of crew lives over the lifetime of the platform. The vehicle is also fitted with electronic warfare equipment, communications, navigation, and situational awareness systems, all sourced from Ukrainian companies that already supply the wheeled armored vehicles UkrArmoTech has been making for the past 3 years. The exact specifications of the EW gear have not been disclosed. Western analysts who have examined the prototype expect a cope cage to be added before serial production, in line with what every other Ukrainian armored vehicle on the front has had to do. The Skif's protection against drones, in other words, is genuinely improved over the M113, but is not, on its own, a complete answer to the threat. The honest assessment is that no current armored personnel carrier on any side of any war anywhere in the world has a complete answer to the modern FPV drone. The Skif is better. It is not invincible. The aluminum hull is the part of the Skif that requires the most caveat. UkrArmoTech's prototype is the first time any Ukrainian defense company has used aluminum armor in a combat vehicle. The choice was deliberate, intended to give the Skif the mobility advantages that aluminium provides over steel for a tracked vehicle of this weight class. But aluminum armor, particularly to the ballistic specifications required for STANAG Level 4 protection, is a controlled material with a small global supplier base, and several of those suppliers are subject to export restrictions that complicate Ukrainian access. There is, by Defense Express's own reporting, a meaningful possibility that UkrArmoTech will have to develop a steel-armored version of the Skif for serial production, which would change the weight profile, the suspension requirements, the fuel consumption, and likely the engine specification. The aluminum prototype, in other words, may not be the production vehicle. The company is open about this. They are running factory trials on the aluminum version, in part to test the fundamental concept of the platform, the driving qualities, the mobility, the load bearing under maximum stress. Whether the production version uses the same hull material is a decision they have not yet made, and they have explicitly said they will make it based on the test data. This is the kind of pragmatic, unglamorous engineering compromise that real wartime industrial development looks like, and that the marketing materials of established defense contractors tend to gloss over. UkrArmoTech is a young enough company that it has not yet learned to be embarrassed about the messiness of its own development process. They told the trade press what they were doing, what their constraints were, and what decisions they had not yet made. The trade press, perhaps surprisingly for an industry famous for hyperbole, mostly reported it that way. The Skif is a real prototype with real constraints made by a real company attempting to solve a real problem on a deadline that the war is setting, and not the company. What it does not yet have is a price tag. UkrArmoTech has not publicly disclosed what the Skif will cost per unit when it enters serial production. The Western point of comparison, the US. Army's Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle, the official replacement for the M113 in American service, costs roughly $2.5 million per copy. The AMPV is not coming to Ukraine. The US has its own production constraints, its own deployment priorities, and the AMPV is not currently part of any planned military aid package to Kyiv. Ukraine, even if it could afford the price, could not afford the weight. The Skif, whatever it costs, is going to be cheaper. Ukrainian defense procurement in 2025 and 2026 has been almost entirely sourced from domestic suppliers, partly because of cost control, partly because of supply chain reliability, and partly because the Ukrainian government has made a deliberate, strategic decision to build out its own industrial base, while it still has the wartime urgency and the political support to do so. UkrArmoTech is one of the companies that has benefited most from that decision. The Skif is the most ambitious product they have built. If it works, if the factory trials validate the concept, if the platform survives the transition from aluminum to steel without losing its core advantages, if the company can scale production from a single prototype to the kind of volumes the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense will actually need, then UkrArmoTech is positioned to take a meaningful share of the tracked APC market, not just in Ukraine, but across the post-Soviet space and potentially into the Middle East, where Khirhii's team has already begun showing their products at the World Defense Show in Saudi Arabia. None of those things are guaranteed. The Skif at the moment is a single prototype undergoing factory trials. It has not yet been deployed in combat. It has not yet been ordered in serial quantities. The company is still figuring out the supply chain. The hull material question is unresolved. There is a meaningful gap between a working prototype and a vehicle that can be produced reliably in the dozens or hundreds for an army at war. That gap is where most defense projects die. But there is something larger about the Skif and about UkrArmoTech that goes beyond the specifications of any single armored vehicle. It is the same thing that the Firepoint cruise missile program represents in the long-range strike domain, that the Magura naval drones represent in the maritime domain, that the dozens of FPV drone manufacturers represent in the close strike domain. Ukraine, in the 4 years since the full-scale war began, has built an entirely new defense industry from a starting position of close to zero. The companies are young, in many cases founded after the invasion. The leadership teams are mostly young, often civilians with technical backgrounds rather than career arms industry professionals. The development cycles are fast. The feedback loops with frontline soldiers are direct, often involving phone calls and telegram messages between battalion commanders and company engineers. The funding structures combine government procurement, private investment, and international donations in ways that are not yet stable but are functional. The export ambitions are real. UkrArmoTech, Firepoint, Frontier Bionic, Skyaton, and a growing list of others are now appearing at international defense exhibitions selling their products to countries that, until recently, would have bought from American, British, French, German, Israeli, or Russian suppliers. The Russian invasion broke the post-war global arms market in a way that nobody who started the invasion intended, and Ukrainian companies are some of the largest beneficiaries. The Skif, in this larger context, is one product in a much bigger story. It is also a product that, if it works, will keep Ukrainian soldiers alive who would otherwise have been killed in M113s that should never have had to be in this war in the first place. The vehicle was designed by a company that did not exist 4 years ago. It is being tested by a country that should never, by any reasonable metric, have been able to afford the kind of full-spectrum domestic defense industry it is now building. It is being built to replace an American vehicle that has, on the Ukrainian battlefield, been turned into a mass-produced coffin by drones that cost less than the bandwidth used to control them. None of this would have happened without the war. The war should not have happened, but the war did happen, and it is happening now, and the men and women of UkrArmoTech are running factory trials on a tracked armored personnel carrier that, 3.5 years ago, did not exist in any form, and that, 3.5 years from now, may be the most produced armored vehicle in the Ukrainian army. Hennadii Khirhii signed the company's incorporation papers 6 months into the war with $2,500 of registered capital. The company he founded then is now one of the largest private vehicle manufacturers in the Ukrainian defense sector. He has not given interviews about whether he expected any of this. He has, in his interviews about the Skif, mostly stuck to the technical merits of tracked versus wheeled vehicles in muddy conditions, which is its own kind of answer. The Skif is the answer he and his team gave to the question their country was asking them. It is not a perfect answer. It is the best answer that could be built on the timeline available by the people who happen to be there to build it. That, in the end, is what wartime industrial improvisation actually looks like. Not heroic, not glamorous, not the kind of thing that fits cleanly on a defense industry magazine cover. Just a small Kyiv company that filed paperwork in August 2022 to repair vehicles. And that is now, in April 2026, building the country's first tracked armored personnel carrier because the country needed one and nobody else was going to.